You're all set to release your podcast to the world, but how on earth does this happen? You're listening to the How to Podcast series of podcasts, a mini series under the umbrella of the Women Who Podcast show. I'm your host, Alison Fraser, the host of the Women Who Podcast show, as well as the Scottish at Heart podcast. And I'm the founder of the Women Who Podcast membership, where women who struggle with the tech, time, and confidence can grow into amazing podcasters. This episode, we're going to talk about where to host your podcast. Links are in the show notes. So you need three things for a podcast. The first is the idea, the second is somewhere to make it, and the third is somewhere to host it. We've covered points 1 and 2 in earlier episodes. Now we're going to get into the hosting. So let's assume you have your idea, you've recorded your first episode, and you're ready to get it out to the world. How on earth does this work? Well, if you have your own website, you might be familiar with a hosting service, and podcasts are just the same. They have their own hosting service to help listeners to access them. A podcast host or server is the place where you upload your finished episodes and add your show notes. Show notes is what we call the text that you see when you look at your podcast app and the episode that you're playing. And I'll do an episode on those too. A podcast server works by creating an RSS feed for your podcast, which is a public URL that listening platforms use to gather show and episode details. All hosting sites provide RSS feeds, but not all distribute them to listening platforms. So if your host or hosting plan doesn't offer podcast distribution, you can do that yourself manually. Submitting your podcast to major listening platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify ensures that you're making the show available to listeners regardless of which platform they use to tune in. There are many different podcast servers out there. I use Spotify for podcasters. Spotify for podcasters doesn't do that distribution automatically, and you have to do the setup yourself following their guidelines. But once you've done that, your podcast will be distributed automatically every time that you release a new episode. Spotify for podcasters is a free service, and I think it offers quite a good deal for that. More than 100 million people use Spotify to access podcasts. Now, Spotify for podcasters is not the same Spotify place where you access your music and podcasts to listen to. It's the back end of that. So it's a separate place, but it all connects. If you already have a Spotify account, you can use this login to set up your podcasting account. On this setup, you can just record and edit your audio. You can arrange your segments, add transitions and background music, and you're all set. If you make your episodes somewhere else, like I do, you can simply upload your file and publish. There are many other servers where you can access a free plan, but the payoff with these is that you usually have a limit on the size of files, how many minutes you can release a month, etc. One of these is Buzzsprout, and I know quite a lot of podcasters who like to use Buzzsprout. The free service allows for 2 hours of uploads a month, but your episodes only stay up for 90 days. The paid for plans enable you to take monthly payments, offer premium content, and have your own podcast website. Other servers include Libsyn, which is where I hosted my very first podcast back in 2014-15, Podbean, Acast, Castos, Hello Audio, and many more. You can change where you host your podcast at any time, so don't worry if you sign up with one and then down the track you want to change again. Once you have an episode or a trailer, you can get yourself set up with your host, get it published, and then tell the world about your podcast. So that's hosting in a nutshell. There are loads of different podcast servers. Find the one that works best for you and your budget. And if you want to change later on, you can do that. Got any questions? Please get in touch by email, alison@alisonfraser.co, or send in a voice message. If you've liked what you've heard so far and you want to learn more from me, then the Women Who Podcast membership is open. The link to join is in the show notes. It's a low-cost membership aimed at making podcasting easy for all members, especially if you struggle with the tech, the time, and the confidence to get your show out. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you again soon.